Moyer. I serve as the Assistant Vice Provost of our UMBC programs here at the universities at Shady Grove in Rockville, Maryland. And we are thrilled that we have a diversity of folks who are joining us this afternoon for our special session on how AI is transforming talent management. So thank you for joining us. We have both prospective students with us, current students, alums, and we hope you'll find this session informative and engaging. So I am going to turn it over to Dr. Elliot Lassen, who is the Program Director of our MPS in IO Psychology here at UMBC Shady Grove. Dr. Lassen, take it away.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you for Chris for all of your behind the scenes work to set this up. What I'd like to do is first, since we do have a kind of a diversity of participants, I'm going to ask Chris to put a poll into the chat. Really, it's just getting a sense of who you are. So she's going to put it into the chat under, looks like Slido maybe. You might see something pop up. Exactly. So if you could just take a moment to put that response in, we will log that response. I'm not sure, Chris, if it might make sense to do this again later, depending on how many people join from now until the end. We can kind of play that by ear. But if you could just take a moment just to log your response, and that way we'll just get a sense of who's out there listening today. But I'm going to, while that's happening, I'm going to really begin. First of all, thank you for joining us today on what hopefully will be an informative discussion about a very contemporary hot topic in the area of HR and talent management. So we're going to be leading off today, both my colleague, Dr. Abad, and I, on talking about how AI is transforming talent management. And then there'll be a Q&A portion that Chelsea mentioned a moment ago, and then we'll be wrapping up by just describing some of the aspects of our Masters of IO Psychology program here at UMBC. So that's really the game plan the rest of the way in our hour or so that we have together. I would begin when I look at the topic title that we've chosen. I would say that I'm not a historian of progress in civilization, but every so often there's an invention, a technology, or innovation that comes out. We use terms like paradigm shift, game changer, disruptor, or the next big thing to describe innovation. In some ways, it might be futuristic, ahead of its time, or even come across as science fiction. I would say that AI, artificial intelligence, is at least one of the above. As with any innovation, there's not only a learning curve, but we sometimes struggle with whether it has emerged too quickly. Sometimes ethicists, and we'll talk about this later, will explore potential downsides that might temper the initial excitement as to the upsides of this phenomenon. Today, we'd like to discuss AI as it pertains to the field of IO. We don't profess to be absolute experts in the field, nor do we know exactly where AI's application might be headed and when that will happen. So with that, let's begin. Technology is advancing at a rapid pace, and IOs and HR professionals must adapt. The goal is to find the right technology capabilities for each step in the talent management process. It's really necessary. So there's a bullet point here of how it is revolutionizing talent management. And Yes, I think it is. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, it will become clear that it is definitely revolutionizing a big thing, and that is, I think, how we should view it. We have to somehow come to grips with it, embrace it, and then also figure out some ways of managing it appropriately. AI in the hiring process refers to the use of artificial intelligence to automate and enhance recruitment tasks, from sourcing and screening candidates to evaluating their skills and predicting their success. Ultimately, if we look at the O of IO, aiming to improve efficiency and make better hiring decisions. So I just want to define a term here that we introduced on this slide, which is Gen AI, which is generative artificial intelligence. Gen AI is a type of AI that can create content based on existing data. It can produce text, images, videos, music, and more. I think we've seen this in social media, certain, let's say, videos that have been produced, maybe posted on TikTok or other platforms. So it's sort of fascinating in a way, because it's, in some respects, maybe science fiction, but being able to instruct some channel of AI to produce things and maybe take existing data and modify them and convert them into things like videos, music, and other things. And obviously there might be some ethical issues with that we know about. But it really is fascinating. But really, that's what it means by generative. It creates new content based on existing data. Gen AI systems are trained on large data sets where they learn different areas of knowledge. That's why when we type something into Google, the first thing that comes up is what is AI generated. And as opposed to the original Google, where it would just send you to links to websites, here it gives you kind of an existing summary taken from those websites and pieces them together, and then you have an answer to your question. Gen AI is a process of learning patterns and features from the data. When prompted, Gen AI analyzes the data and generates new content that's similar to what is learned. ChatGPT is perhaps one of the more popular tools for AI today, but it's just one tool. It's not synonymous with AI. There are other AI tools for, let's say, photography. I think one of my first forays into AI was taking a picture, a photograph that was blurry because it was maybe a little pixel, it was low resolution, and I happened to be sitting with a photographer, and she said, "Oh, you can put that into an AI tool, and it would sharpen it up." And to me, it was fascinating how quickly that could be done. And something that goes back over a year or two ago, where that technology was already there. There's some challenges for Gen AI, because one challenge is that Gen AI models can sometimes produce inaccurate or nonsensical data, known as hallucination. So if we use that metaphor, when we have a hallucination about something that's not real. So Gen AI is turning something into turning data into things that are only an illusion, but not real. They call those hallucinations. And the hallucinations, if you rely on them, can have serious consequences in mission-critical applications. So as these things go, researchers are figuring out ways on improving the accuracy and coherence of Gen AI outputs. So looking at the HR aspects of it, just to kind of jump into that, what Gen AI is doing, it is using data analytics and machine learning to enhance HR functioning. Certain tasks that Dr. Abad will be talking about, where you start from an applicant pool that have furnished application materials such as an application or a resume, and getting from that point A to points B, C, and D that are further in the selection process. AI's tools help getting from that first step, the very initial step, to further steps in the process. The goal is to utilize those technologies to make more accurate hiring decisions, to improve efficiency in the hiring decision, as well as to shepherd candidates along in the process so they don't feel that they've been ghosted. So AI can be used to maintain that high touch in a way.
I'll take over. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about this. So to go a little bit deeper in terms of focusing on a specific example, sort of the recruitment or recruitment process, from sort of beginning attracting candidates to the final decision making in terms of selecting the best candidate. As Elliot had stated, we're using, as IOs and HR professionals, we're using generative AI in our daily work and using it to help us work more efficiently and function better. So it's understandable that you're going to see this in some of the areas that we currently work in. And AI in recruitment is not really a new concept. Anyone that's works in HR or has even applied for a job, we all kind of understand now that our resumes are screened for keywords and things like that. So that's not a new use, but we are finding newer ways to use generative AI in that recruitment process. So as one example, traditionally, AI would be used to kind of identify sort of the top candidates and screen everyone else out. But one of the goals is to kind of blend the automation with the human touch. So for example, IBM, what they do is they only use AI to eliminate those resumes or candidates that don't meet the minimum qualifications. So instead of only reviewing the top 5 or 10 candidates, there's now a wider range of candidates that recruiters can actually subjectively review, and that kind of broadens the candidate pool. It kind of adds the human element and review into the process. So there's different ways you can use generative AI to kind of develop a more personal experience for the candidates as well. So one aspect is the candidate experience. As Elliot had mentioned, there are multiple steps in the recruitment process from beginning to end. And that process can be really confusing to candidates, not hearing back, not knowing what the status is of their applications. So generative AI using chatbots can actually communicate with potential candidates to kind of give them some support by answering questions, describing sort of the timeline of what to expect, such as next steps, updating the candidate in a more personalized way. So those are just some examples. And then also using predictive analytics. Gen AI typically can use much larger data sets, rely on much larger data sets than traditionally we would using statistical packages such as SPSS or R, and can really kind of combine information for a variety of different sources regarding employee data to help identify employee trends, and even help to suggest different roles for a particular candidate. So perhaps a candidate applied for a job, for a particular job, but there's actually other jobs that are available that that candidate might be a better fit. And generative AI can kind of make those connections. So there's really, the focus is really to find a way to enhance the process of recruitment and selection, and balancing this new technology and automation with more human-centric decision making. So the candidate experience is sort of the first part of that, of how we use Gen AI in the employee pipeline. And then the second functional area is in how we develop our assessments. So that's on the next slide, please. Oh.
Yes, I just wanted to interject.
Yeah.
I wanted to interject, turning the tables for a moment, starting from the organization and looking outward. And the above kind of are all legitimate questions. And that is, to what extent did the applicant or candidate use AI in presenting themselves for the job? And we can look at different ways of approaching, different channels of approaching during the process. It could be an email approach or entree, sending a resume. Was the resume developed through AI? Did AI have something to do with the application that's presented, or the cover letter, or a work sample that is put together and submitted, or perhaps performance on an assessment? Because typically we make assumptions on how genuine work is, and that the provider or deliverer was in fact responsible for what is being submitted. And this applies really in work and academic settings. Certainly in higher education, we discuss this in the framework of academic integrity. After all, students are tested and graded constantly. So we're constantly thinking about those, the work that's submitted. In a bit, we're going to discuss ethical concerns, but we can ask ourselves, is the final deliverable, including its quality, all that matters at the end of the day? Or are we still placing value on the process as a means to an end? I sometimes think about, and I say this with caution because knowing the demographic of many of my students, where I'll throw out the advent of the calculator, the handheld calculator, and now they're so infrequent because you can do that on any smartphone. But when the calculator first came out, probably in the 1970s, educators were concerned that this new invention would obviate the need for young people to do math by hand, three-digit decimal problems, long division. 50 years later or so, do those skills really even matter anymore? So some of this brings up the idea of taking credit for work being one's own, given the tools that are available. And what happens, this is an important question, when those tools are available for some, but not all people? When the internet first started, there was this notion of the digital divide that differentiated between haves and have-nots, that people that did not have access to the internet for perhaps socioeconomic reasons may have been precluded from participating in, let's say, an employment application process. So here we can also think about, we can think about those people that don't have the AI tools. Does that put them at a disadvantage when it comes to completing work or presenting oneself for a job application. I do this as a pause, just to keep this in mind as we go forward in our conversation, because it is something that organizations are going to be looking at and concerned about, the way that a candidate presents themselves to a job application. So I just wanted to interject this point at this juncture. Dr. Abad.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for that. I do think using generative AI to enhance our work products, it's being done in organizations, but I think one of the key points is really to maintain our voice or be able to still use our authentic voice so it still reflects the writer or the producer, and using generative AI to sort of help in the process, but still being owned by the person that's creating. So we talked a little bit about the candidate experience, but assessment is also the other AI area that AI is used in terms of the selection process. So as many of you know, depending on our job function, a big part of our job as IOs is to develop and validate selection and promotion assessments, and they can be tests, personality inventories, and AI can actually help us do this more efficiently in a number of different ways. So developing psychometrically sound assessments, such as interviews, even sort of situational judgment tests, helping to identify what the critical incidents are and then potential answers. In terms of not on the development side, but the implementation, maybe conducting initial interviews to assess minimum qualifications or suitability, and then analyzing and summarizing candidate responses, taking narrative information from a structured interview and analyzing the data, summarizing responses, summarizing notes from interviewers. So all these different things are being used to help make the process more efficient, and help the hiring managers be able to make the best and most informed, valid decisions in hiring the best person for the job. We talked already a little bit about making the AI-driven predictions by matching the best candidate to the particular job. And then in terms of development, and we have our principles and standards in IO psychology development of valid selection procedures. So will still apply even if generative AI and algorithms are being used to develop those assessment tools. The same rules apply in terms of developing valid and reliable tools that have minimal adverse impact. So, the 4/5 rule and relying on adverse impact apply to AI generation. Ultimately, AI may creep in unintentionally and result in adverse impact. But then, that has to be found, identified, and then fixed. Either the algorithm needs to be enhanced or fixed to reduce that bias, and make sure that the actual outcomes are not discriminating against one particular group. So, the rules still apply, whether it's being generated, content is being generated through algorithms or not. So we need to be mindful of that. I know in the media, there's a lot of talk about bias, AI and bias. And, we're learning, there's a greater awareness. We can go to the next slide. I'll talk about bias, I think, on the next slide. More awareness of bias as we learn more, and as our society learns more about generative AI. We hear, like I said, in the news about how there's bias in these algorithms, and we all have some bias. We have implicit bias, and we're the ones as humans are building the algorithms. So there's going to be some type of bias in those algorithms. So it's really important to sort of monitor and test to try to remove any unintended bias. There was IBM has like I don't know if it's like a video, an interview, and I was reviewing it, and they kind of talked about an example of how bias kind of creeped into their selection process. So they developed sort of the algorithms for hiring candidates, and they found that the top few candidates actually all went to the same university. And then after doing some research, they realized that the technology people that were building the algorithms, they all went to that university. So even though it was unintentional in their development of the algorithm, they were relying on certain definitions of what they consider like good performance or a good candidate based on their experience at their own university. And then that was actually found to be used in the algorithm to actually select those candidates. So obviously they found the problem and they identified that pattern and then removed the bias. So I think the key point is that it's important to continually test to try to identify bias and make those fixes. And sometimes that bias isn't detectable until after the algorithm has been tested and actually is being used. So there needs to be some type of governance within organizations, and that can even be like an AI ethical board that reviews and develops policy. But it's not something that you just do once and that's it. Just same with like adverse impact analysis. You can develop a valid selection instrument, but then you need to repeatedly over time continually doing adverse impact analysis to make sure there is no bias in your or discrimination in your assessments. And it would be the same thing with the algorithms. So this sort of governance is key. And there are other ways to remove bias in the training data that's initially used to develop the algorithms. So ensuring that there's more diversity, different types of people, different locations, really having a training data that includes that diversity. And then when you're cleaning the data to kind of remove some of those demographics. So as not to let some of that bias creep in. Okay, that's what I have on bias.
Yes, I just wanted to mention something that Dr. Abad and I were talking about this morning, that there have been some governmental efforts to, when there's some sort of selection system in place using AI to disclose the algorithms that are used. New York City has a bill 144 that in 2023, I believe, when it came online, it addressed this. So the question is whether that is something that will be addressed by other governmental entities in the future.
Okay, next slide.
Okay, so I think I'm on this one. When we consider talent management throughout the employee life cycle, there are applications of AI that can enhance the experience. The intuitiveness and automated nature of AI can do periodic check-ins with employees to gauge how things are going. One question that I have is whether that outsourcing a function for which human touch might be more effective. But I guess that there might be some useful and aggregated metrics that are collected using AI throughout the employee life cycle. So the ideal combination might be the AI input paired with manager input. And then you also have situations where AI capabilities can be leveraged to support competency development. As an employee progresses throughout the employee life cycle. There might be some opportunities for development that might be picked up on by the AI. I mean, it sounds like science fiction, but let's say if AI would take a look at the employee's communication through email, and maybe that can pick up on some language that was used or some grammatical errors or lack of proofreading. So that could be detected through AI that ordinarily may not be picked up on or paid attention to. And also the use of chatbots have the advantage of a more 24/7 customer service in HR matters. Let's say if you have a question about benefits or something like that, and you're thinking about it at 11 o'clock at night when there's nobody to answer the phone. So there might be some use of chatbots to help people with their HR business. We recently ran a course in our program called People Analytics. It's a new course that we developed in our Masters of IO program at UMBC. And the course's objectives really mirror what's on this slide, which is taking inventory of skill sets, the employees that have them, and where there might be some skill gaps. It also, using AI, allows for contingency scenarios, such as succession planning, should there be any retirements or departures. In my humble opinion, these types of tools can be very helpful. But once again, I think you need to balance that with experienced human judgment. You shouldn't totally outsource something to AI that basically says that, okay, this person is going to be leaving. We predict that this person is going to be leaving in 2 years, based on some analytics, and going with that at face value. I think that there needs to be some checks and balances there.
Okay, so we can talk a little bit about ethical considerations. It sort of creeped in. We were mentioning bias, and Dr. Lassen had mentioned publishing algorithms. So I think that's on everybody's mind, like how to use Gen AI ethically. I know on the academic side, we talk about that and how can Gen AI be used to help us with writing or doing aspects of sort of like the literature review process, but not actually writing for us, and kind of differentiating the use of AI versus plagiarizing and what that looks like. So similar concerns occur on the IO side in terms of organizations. So in general, I think being transparent and identifying sort of what the organizations, whether it's through the human resources department, kind of comes up with policies and procedures that dictate how to that govern the use of AI, how to use it in employees' work tasks, and then also disclosing the use of AI and data management to the public. So organizations should communicate their AI usage to the public. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it internally versus externally. But what it does is it kind of reinforces that the organization is actually engaging in ethical practices. And that transparency also builds trust with your customers or clients, or just general community. And then it also demonstrates innovation. So keeping in step with the technological advances and how quickly AI is being transformed. There are so many different tools that are out there now that are used for graphics, that are used for writing. So just ensuring or letting other people know that that the organization is also innovative in its approach. Also having communicating these policies and procedures and identifying when generative AI is being used can also mitigate the misuse of AI, reduce generating misinformation, and then or violating employee privacy. And there's some best practices on how to do that, sort of being specific, explaining what AI is used for, like in the workspace, what types of tasks, what types of projects, the type of data that it uses, how generative AI sort of makes decisions or is involved in the decision-making process. And then also providing contact information. So there's actually a human being that somebody can contact to ask questions about Gen AI practices. And then also obviously things like using clear and understandable language and training employees also on how to use AI ethically is really important. And then, having those actual AI policies and communicate within the organization about what some of the ethical implications are. So actually having those conversations, not just when employees can use AI and how to use it, but how to do so ethically, and what are the implications of not using AI ethically in your work products.
I would say that AI is, in fact, one of the next big things that we've experienced. There's an incredible amount of capital that has been poured into this bandwagon. And I suspect that if I went to a SHRM conference, there would be plenty of glitzy demos or platforms featured that are available for purchase. Having been to the PSYOP conference on a regular basis, I can say that past 2 years already, any session does not go by without some mention of AI. There's some application of AI. There's so many titles of sessions that have AI in the title. It's really unbelievable. So I would say it is definitely, it has been one of the next big things. Second, we might be seeing more of AI used in areas like executive coaching, which will address competencies like emotional intelligence and self-awareness in developing leaders. And as we have seen today, there would need to be some ethical guardrails for us to think about to serve as checks and balances for fair and inclusive workplaces. So here are our takeaways in closing. AI, I think we can all agree, has been a game changer in many areas, including talent management. And the second, that yes, AI input can be helpful, but we need to maintain the human element in judgment as well as the high touch. And finally, as Dr. Abad pointed out, you can't just have, similar to adverse impact, you can't just have some sort of assessment of that phenomena at one point in time and not revisit it continuously. So that is really the third takeaway. At this juncture, I think we're pretty good on our timeline. We're going to open it up to questions. I don't know if any questions. Let me check the chat. We can open it up either to questions in the chat, or if you care to unmute yourself to ask that question. We have a few minutes before we transition to the next part of our presentation.
Or even just comments, what your experience has been, or what your, views are on what we've covered.
And Dr. Lassen, we did receive one statement while you're presenting, we have an individual, Caroline, who is with us and is interested in learning more about our IO program. So I shared that you'll be covering that shortly, more details about the program.
Sure, yeah. That one I caught. Any other, we're open up to any Qs and As and comments in the chat, or we definitely don't have a crystal ball because we're following this just like everybody else, but we're tied into how at least the field of IO and HR are thinking about it.
I know we have some alumni that are working in the field now, so I wouldn't mind, if you have any experiences that you'd like to share in terms of how Gen AI is being used in your organization or in your department, and even, what the perspective of Gen AI as part of the HR, as part of doing HR work. I'd be interested in hearing that.
Okay. I think if there are no questions at this juncture, we're going to move on to information. Leah, okay. Lassner. Okay. I know a little bit about Leah and where she works. So I'm glad to hear that that's happening.
Right.
Okay. Our priest was trying to unmute. Looks like he just had a comment, about the session rather than a question. So we're going to move on at this point. Just if you follow the next slide, we're going to just give some of the highlights of our IO psychology program at UMBC, located at Shady Grove. Okay. All right. So our program, I would say, would be categorized as an applied program rather than a research-based program. It's research-informed, but it's not research-based. We don't have a master's thesis requirement at this time. So it's based on IO psychology. That's our science that informs us. That's like the really big picture description of our program. Getting down to the nuts and bolts of our program, we have what we call our core, which are more theoretical in nature courses, as well as specialty courses, call them electives, if you will. And what that does is it gives choice to the student. We have our first semester is sort of fixed in the 2 courses that our students will take. But after that, it's just making sure that every student is able to check the boxes from each of the core and specialty courses. We'll talk about the breakdown in a moment. But it does allow for customization. We have courses that run on different nights of the week, if that is a pragmatic factor. Here are a few of our, what I would refer to as our value adds to the program, maybe unique features in a way. And I will use a phrase that I've been known to use called seize the opportunity, where these experiences outside of the classroom are made available to our students, some of which are part of the academic program, but part of it is outside of our formal academic program, which includes our advisory board, which are made up of a dozen HR and IO psychology leaders who are there to mentor our students. They advise us on curriculum. They're involved in our students' career development. They give us heads ups on opportunities that they hear about within their organization or elsewhere. So it's really been a great addition to the program since we started that in 2016. see that there's some comments, we might be able to address them later that are popping up. The second point that about our experience is called the capstone experience. And that is done as the final semester course that all of our students will take, which is an applied consulting project with a real organization. We have an optional practicum that some of our students take, which is designed to accrue mentorship under a senior HR leader in an organization, where that person can be an IOS consultant or an HR administrator within the organization, to get that direct mentorship from somebody really high level. And there are occasionally consulting projects that we will share with our students to get involved in, as well as professional associations that we know about, that we really encourage our students to become members of and participate in. In some cases, there's some limited financial support as well. The structure of our program, I mentioned this a moment ago, is broken down into core and specialty courses. So there are 5 specialty courses, 5 core courses, 4 specialty courses are electives, 1 capstone. Most of our students will take 2 courses a semester because our program is designed for working professionals, so that our classes happen in the evening, usually starting around 6 o'clock. On our Shady Grove campus, although we have some courses that I would classify as hybrid. We have even some options that are virtual. For example, our capstone experience is by definition a virtual one that doesn't involve coming to class every single week. And we have a number of courses that have a field component that is out in industry. So doing the math, it's really simple math. Each of our courses are 3 credits times 10 required courses, 30 total credits for graduation. I'll also mention at this time 2 certificates that can be done independently outside of the degree program that might be appropriate for people that are deeper into their career and want to get that specialization. But for those who are early or mid-career, students can take courses that will meet the requirements, that will represent a specialization underneath the degree, call it like a minor, so to speak. So you would get your master's in IO and a minor or a certificate in organizational consulting or training and talent development. So those are made up of 12 credits that can be either done independently or embedded within the master's degree. So that's really just a snapshot of our program at a glance. And there are 2 portals of information and how to apply. We are now in our application season, which runs from November to May. So there still is time to submit an application for the fall 2025 cohort that will be coming in September, late August, September. So there's also the email address for information, and that way you can get pretty much all the information that you will need about the program between the website and any questions that you might have, any logistic questions perhaps that are not covered on the website. It's a kind of a long email, but once you type it in once, you won't have to type it in again. But that's sgprofessionalprograms@umbc.edu. Okay. Given the increasing accessibility of AI tools, how can talent management or HIO practitioners effectively detect and mitigate the use of AI by candidates, specifically during technical and behavioral interviews?
I started to answer that, so I can maybe.
Yeah, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So I know that's something, people when they apply for jobs, they try to do research anyway, even like how to answer a behavioral, but a structured interview question and looking at what the competencies are and kind of thinking about how to answer. And I feel putting making a good impression and without also misrepresenting yourself is, part of the interview process. So I think there are ways of structuring the questions to, maybe avoid actually like reading an answer in real time. But I know I've heard stories where people actually, the AI is actually giving you the answer in real time as the question is being asked in the interview. But if you're asking for a specific example that happened in their past, or finding a way to personalize the answer, so it would be more difficult for Gen AI to provide an answer. But I'm not really sure, unless you having video, you're doing face-to-face interviews. That would be a way to mitigate it, because they're not going to be on their phone while they're in an actual face-to-face interview. That's my take on that question. I don't know if Dr. Lassen, if you have another perspective or solution.
No, that's good. That's good. Nothing to add on that one. So Caprice chimed in. I spoke with a few AI practitioners this week, and some individuals were expressing fear of AI taking over the human approach of IO professionals. To get ahead of the fear, the suggestions of how IO practitioners and students can experience and/or practice in utilizing generative AI in talent management processes. So I think you ask a specific question here, but I think, Caprice, it also speaks to a broader question that we have from other areas as well, other areas of life where there's been some paradigm shifts, some changes, and we really need to stay involved in the processes and role model, let's say, the importance of having that human touch, because I think there's a tendency, especially with AI and other tools that are somewhat automated, that speed things up for us, that give us the illusion of efficiency, that we're going to over-rely on them. But I think IO practitioners, if we are able to maybe even step up our human touch in dealing with people, dealing with candidates, dealing with employees, and not just relying on automation. I think sometimes we fall into a trap. I'll just give you an example where you have two people that are working together, maybe even in adjacent cubicles, and they're messaging each other using texts or some other chat, as opposed to actually going over to that person and engaging that person's humanity. So I would say that it's important for us to role model that humanity and just reinforce the notion of the human touch being important. And we need to stay involved. We need to stay involved and keep parroting that message of the importance of the human touch, the importance of having a second look at things before decisions, mission critical decisions, are made about people's lives, about whether to hire, whether to terminate somebody, not simply just rely on these tools. So I would say really just staying in the game and role modeling that personal touch would be ways of doing that. You can't control other people, obviously, the way other people and managers handle this, but as we are emerging into the workplace, as our students and alumni are emerging into the workplace, really just maintain that human value within our work. That's what I would say. Anything, Dr. Abon, anything to add on that?
No, I think being mindful of that, and when we're using technology, finding ways to maximize sort of the human, the human decision-making piece, and only relying on Gen AI for things that can help us do our jobs better, but still being present. But it's going to be harder, we can have that value, have that value, but not every everybody
Right.
is. So it's going
And
to
just talk about it.
Yeah.
And I would say just talk about it. Talk about these issues. Just keep bringing it up. Keep bringing up the human element, the guardrails of not over relying on AI. Just keep those values on the front burner. It's as we're talking, I'm kind of looking at all the options that I have. There's a little circle here. It says Open AI Assistant Panel. So AI is definitely everywhere in our lives. Okay. At this juncture, I think we're pretty good on time. Chelsea, I think we've captured what we've wanted to discuss in our 58 minutes, which is mindful of everybody's time. So we can start on time and complete our presentation on time. And I would just end off by saying thank you, everybody, for participating. Just to reiterate, Miriam. Oh, nice to see you, Miriam. I wanted to just emphasize that our application season is still open for applying to our IO program. We're also taking inquiries and questions and the like. Hopefully, between our presentation today about the program, the website, or any questions that you might have, please send them through the email that you have a good sense of what our program is all about at least two of the faculty members, what keeps us up at night and what we think about. So we wish you success in all of your endeavors, and thank you for joining us today.